October 15, 2017. It's Sunday morning in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. A town of 50,000 that's about as close as Southeast Mississippi comes to a big city.
Hattiesburg is actually the 5th largest city in the state.
Life in Mississippi is pretty similar to like other rural southern states. People are very family oriented.
People know everybody. In some of these small towns, you can leave your doors unlocked. Leave your windows open.
But Hattiesburg isn't like most of rural Mississippi. And a little before noon that Sunday, 27-year-old Tracy Bullock makes a panicked call to Lamar County 911.
911, what's your emergency?
Yes, my
Tracy stated that his girlfriend was shot.
Where is she shot?
She got shot in the head.
He said that they need to hurry up because she needed attention.
I'll send first responders to you now.
When a call comes into 911, there's a shooting or a robbery or something that's happening right then and there, it becomes a code 1, a priority, so they try to get officers there as fast as they can.
But will they get there in time to save 19-year-old Davisha Harris?
Hurry, please, hurry, she's bleeding. Hey, Bishop.
Before moving to Hattiesburg, Davisha Harris spent most of her life in tiny Gloucester, Mississippi. Population, 897.
The town has got like 8, 9 stop signs and no red lights.
We have just one grocery store. We have maybe 3 gas stations, and that's it.
The third of 4 children, Davisha was the only daughter.
All of them spoiled, but Naivete was the spoilest, I do believe. She would probably get maybe more gifts than the other kids. Her mother, Tasha, my wife, they always say it's daddy's girl. Yeah, that's daddy's girl, but when it comes down to my wife, anywhere my wife went, she was right along with her. Or she was gonna fall out crying because she couldn't go.
Davisha and I, we were very close. Pretty much we could talk about anything. She could come to me with anything.
She was always a happy-go-lucky young lady. Just beautiful inside and out.
And nearly everyone in their tiny town agreed.
She was very popular among her peers. Even adults knew Davisha in the community. She knew the grandmother, she knew the mother, she knew the cousins, even the out-of-town relatives, people that we didn't even know existed. Davisha knew them.
Davisha was the type of person, you go down the road, she allowed to let the window down and over the car door, hey, Lucy! That's the type of person she was, all over town.
She was a person that saw the beauty in everyone.
But what Davisha enjoyed most was making others laugh.
She was the jokester of the family, life of the party. She actually won class clown in her senior year.
You can't even get mad at her because as soon as you look at her, I bust out laughing. That was our relationship.
But despite her vibrant personality, Davisha was anything but worldly.
Davisha's parents sheltered her in a lot of ways.
Davisha rarely went anywhere. If she did, it was usually with me. She got a little older, we gave her a little room, but it wasn't very much.
She was not allowed to date while in high school.
Which may explain why after graduation, Davisha couldn't wait to go out on her own.
She was supposed to leave in August to go to community college here in Hattiesburg, but she came to me and her dad actually maybe 2 days after she graduated and said she wanted to go to summer school. I think she graduated May the 20th, and she left on May the 31st from home to Hattiesburg.
And once she was in the big city of Hattiesburg, there was no looking back.
Gloucester is like 900 people compared to 50,000 people in a town like Hattiesburg. For people like Davisha, who grow up in small towns like that, the lure of the bright city lights are appealing.
She was a small town girl looking to start her life as an independent adult just to see what the big city has to offer.
Davisha quickly came into her own.
She enjoyed going to college and working at a call center. She did well in both. She was a productive citizen. She was.
She also had big plans for her future.
Her mom is a nurse.
So she always talked about being a nurse, following in her mom's footsteps.
She was planning on transferring into the nursing program.
She was definitely going places.
And she wasn't going alone. By the time she started her second year in college, she'd met Tracy Bullock.
It was her first serious romantic relationship.
She actually met him through a friend she met while attending college.
He was older and wasn't a student.
So what you going to school for?
I want to be a nurse like my mom.
He was very charismatic, charming.
And he was more than happy to show Davisha around town.
That was a sense of relief, like I'm not going through this alone. I find this guy that I've connected with and can kind of navigate life with, and that made her happy.
But no amount of guidance could steer Davisha clear of danger.
Hello?
In a frantic call to 911, Tracy said Davisha's been shot.
Hurry, please, hurry, she's bleeding.
First responders race to the scene. But there's little they can do for Davisha.
Please, help her! Your head!
They found the victim with apparent gunshot wounds to the head.
When they checked her vitals, Davisha was already dead.
She's gone.
That's a tragedy. Tragedy.
And according to Tracy, it was completely random.
He said a vehicle was driving through and actually shot up the apartment.
They was just shooting up the place.
He was saying that it could have potentially been gang violence.
"19-year-old Davisha Harris had moved to the big city to get a leg up on life.
She was eager to start college and get a job, and she did both when she moved here to Hattiesburg.
She also entered her first serious relationship with 27-year-old Tracy Bullock.
That was a lot of new transitions for a young person, and so to have someone that was older, much more experienced, made her happy.
But on October 15th, 2017, her young life, so full of promise, would end in tragedy.
Lamar County Sheriff Office received a call from 911.
Yes, my girlfriend just...
Tracy called to say that Davisha had just been shot.
Hurry, please, hurry, she's bleeding.
By the time police arrived, she was already dead.
She's gone.
News of Davisha's murder quickly reaches her family.
My son called and said that her neighbor had messaged him through Facebook and told him that Davisha had been shot. And by the time I got up, he was calling right back and saying she was gone. She was dead. And at that point, I just fell out onto the ground.
While Davisha's family rushes to the apartment for answers, homicide detectives arrive at the scene and start to piece together what happened.
They had the victim, who of course suffered from an apparent gunshot wound, so they know the firearm was involved, but there was none at the scene. That makes it a little more difficult because you want to have that murder weapon.
They do locate Davisha's cell phone, however.
The phone was protected by a passcode.
They bagged and sent it to the crime lab so they could hopefully gain access to whatever was in the phone.
Sometimes that takes a little while to break into it.
Then, once their brief survey of the scene is complete, detectives turn to Davisha's boyfriend, Tracy, who was waiting outside the apartment.
He had been waiting in the back of the squad car ever since the first officers arrived on the scene.
As a detective, the first thing you want to do is talk to witnesses.
They told me she was dead.
I'm sorry, sir.
Do you want to tell us what happened?
Yes, I saw the whole thing.
He said he heard tires squeal, and when he looked out the window, he saw a car coming down the street.
The passenger window rolled down, but I didn't see a gun.
However, according to Tracy, he did hear the shots.
Somebody was doing a drive-by shooting.
Could you see who was in the vehicle?
No. I didn't see anybody.
Do you have a license plate number?
No. Soon as they started shooting, I hit the floor.
For detectives, it sounds like an all too familiar scenario.
Despite being a city of less than 50,000, Hattiesburg does have a gang problem.
It's kind of the central location between Mobile, Jackson, and New Orleans.
A lot of the drug trafficking between those larger cities passes through Hattiesburg.
But if this was a drive-by, who was the intended target?
Davisha was not one to be known for running around with gangs or any kind of criminal behavior.
She was a good girl, going to college.
Was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was she with the wrong person?
While detectives were talking to Tracy, officers ran a search on his name in police records.
In doing interviews with witnesses, it's common to want to check their background just to see who you're talking to.
When the officer enters his name into the computer, something pops.
He was wanted on a warrant in Macomb from where he originally from.
They were looking for him anyway.
Hey, detectives. You're aware you got a warrant out for your arrest?
What you doing?
He was arrested on the scene for violation of probation.
Detectives figured it was a way to keep tabs on him until they fully understood his involvement in the shooting.
The squad car carrying Tracy into custody has barely pulled away when Davisha's parents arrive on the scene.
Where's my baby?
He was gone by the time we got there. And I tried to make my way into the apartment to see my daughter, but they wouldn't let me.
They stopped us. They didn't want us to go in the apartment.
You try to be compassionate and explain to them that you're going to do everything that you can, and hopefully you can get to some answers at the end of the day, but it's still tough.
Once I figured out how bad it was. I'm glad I didn't. I didn't want to see my daughter like that, the situation where it was.
I want to remember like she was, you know.
At the scene, detectives try to interview Davisha's parents, but they're too distraught for a formal statement.
Emotionally, it was tough because there's our only daughter.
No parents expect to outlive your children. No one expects to have to bury their child.
But when Davisha's oldest brother arrives at the apartment, he agrees to speak with police.
Where's Tracy?
The first thing he asked is, where's Tracy?
We have him in custody.
They had arrested Tracy at that time under other charges, though.
She'll be trying for murder.
Why is that?
He was not too fond of Tracy.
In fact, Davisha's brother said he'd had a tense encounter with Tracy just a few weeks earlier.
I wish he'd have whooped his ass.
Davisha Harris's brother has told the detectives investigating her murder that he wouldn't be surprised if her boyfriend, Tracy Bullock, had something to do with it.
At this point, police already had Tracy in custody, but that arrest had nothing to do with the murder investigation.
He was arrested for a warrant that he had out.
However, detectives suspect Tracy may have been the true target of Davisha's killer.
She died in what Tracy described as a drive-by shooting.
Why do you think he's involved?
The guy's bad news.
Although, according to Davisha's brother, he'd only met Tracy once.
It was just 2 weeks before the murder.
He had a cell phone charger that Davisha wanted to borrow.
He lives in Hattiesburg as well, and he was going to take her charger.
He just went to her home just to see if she was there to drop it off.
That's when Davisha's brother noticed their mother's car in the parking lot.
She had borrowed my car because we had to change a flat out on her car.
She'd gotten a flat while she was back home in Gloucester over the weekend.
Being such a small town, there wasn't no repair shop there to take care of it, so we just switched cars to let her come back to Hattiesburg and come to school and work.
But when her brother noticed someone was smoking in the car, he was furious.
He's wondering what's going on when he saw this stranger sitting in his mother's car smoking marijuana.
He was sitting in the car smoking dope, chilling with the air on like he owned it.
My oldest son, he actually recorded, sitting in the car with the windows up and stuff. And he sent us the picture back to tell us what the guy was doing in the car, and he wasn't pleased with it.
Oh! What are you doing?
So Davisha's brother confronted Tracy.
Not that he knew who Tracy was at the time.
No one in the family knew about the relationship.
None of us had met him officially, so we didn't know his name, He opened the door and asked him to get out the car and asked him what was he doing, smoking marijuana and music up loud, blasting.
Who the hell are you? This is my mom's car. Well, you best to get the running to her.
When he got him out of it, the dude was still kind of disrespectful.
He got out of the car and proclaimed that it was his girlfriend's car. He can do whatever he wants to do.
That's how we found out who he was.
I don't care who you are. Don't be smoking in my mom's car. You gonna make me?
He and my oldest son did have some words.
Tracy, it's okay. It's okay.
In the midst of those words, Davisha came and got in between them.
I don't know. She didn't want to see his brother go to jail or was in love with this fool. I don't know.
Davisha's brother says he'd let it go.
I guess since he's my sister's boyfriend, he kind of had permission.
Before he left, he did have a word with his sister.
That brother was, hey sister, are you sure this is what you want?
The behavior that my son has saw that wasn't acceptable to any of us,
He was smoking weed and, doing the things that they didn't care to be around.
I'm not a baby anymore.
I know.
I can look after myself. Go inside.
Davisha felt like that he just didn't want her with anybody, but that wasn't the case, in that scenario. That wasn't the case. It was what he was doing.
So that's why you think he had something to do with it?
Yeah.
It was just a hunch.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, something ain't right.
Detectives don't entirely disagree, but their suspicion of Tracy is based on something more concrete than him smoking marijuana or being disrespectful to Davisha's brother.
Despite Tracy's claim that Davisha was killed in a drive-by, there was no evidence to support that.
There were no bullet holes, no shell casings.
Not a single one.
It didn't make any sense.
He didn't even try to even come up with a plausible lie.
Detectives investigating Davisha Harris's homicide suspect her death wasn't due to a drive-by shooting, as her boyfriend Tracy Bullock claimed.
There were no bullet holes in the couple's apartment building.
Detectives couldn't find any shell casings in the street either.
When they canvassed the neighbors, none of them said anything about a car driving through and shooting things up.
The evidence don't support that there was any kind of drive-by.
Which means that Tracy has some explaining to do.
From the crime scene, detectives head back to the county jail, where Tracy is waiting in a holding cell.
Detectives had already taken him into custody for an outstanding warrant.
When confronted with the inconsistencies between his drive-by story and the conditions at the crime scene, Tracy admits that he'd lied.
Okay, man, it wasn't no drive-by shooting. It wasn't, okay?
Well, what you said was?
Because I know how y'all work.
He didn't tell the truth because he had this distrust for the police.
Mississippi has its fair share of challenges as it relates to racial issues around policing.
Okay, so who shot her then?
I don't know.
Tracy says that instead of a drive-by, it had all started with a knock at their door.
You expecting somebody?
No.
He said that when he opened the door, there was a man on their doorstep with a gun.
Tracy said he ducked and slammed the door.
And the shooter didn't try to come in?
No. He must have ran off.
The way Tracy told the story, it sounded like someone tried to put a hit out on him.
But according to Tracy, the would-be hitman missed their target.
Oh my God.
But you don't know who the shooter was.
Dude had a hoodie on.
Detectives aren't sure if he's lying about the shooter's identity.
Given his criminal record, there may be a connection that Tracy doesn't want the detectives digging into.
Or is it simply his drive-by shooting story all over again?
The passenger window rolled down, but I didn't see a guy.
The police catch him in the lie. His story changes. Okay, somebody came to the door, knocked on the door, and he was shooting at me, but there was nothing to substantiate that.
The next day, when detectives finally sit down with Davisha's parents, they have no doubt that Tracy is lying about the mysterious hitman.
They saw the red flags. They had the concerns in the weeks, the months leading up to her death. And so for them, it was like, no, we know who is responsible.
So, what sort of red flags?
Well, first of all, her finances, for one thing.
When she get paid on Fridays, she'll provide everything she needed up to the time for her to get paid again. But we noticed where she would come home on Fridays, she wouldn't have money to get back to Hattiesburg on Sunday.
When you taking food out, I'll freeze the refrigerator, take it back. Like, I mean, you working, why you need all this here?
She didn't respond at all, She didn't have anything much to say.
But the answer became clear a couple of weeks before the homicide.
That's when Davisha's brother found out she had a boyfriend.
We still didn't know his name at that point, but he was sitting in my car, smoking marijuana with the windows up, with the music on loud.
It didn't give her parents a good impression of Tracy.
They got to figure that, he was using her.
She started saying, I want you to meet him, and that's when I started questioning her about who is he, where does he work? And when she gave me those answers, I told her I wouldn't be interested in it because he was much older than she was and he didn't have a job, so I'm not interested.
Just meet him. I know you'll like him. I don't think so.
Mom! He didn't fit the standards of what we had raised her for, and what we had raised her around and what her dad showed her what a man was supposed to be. That's what I told her up front.
I told her, Naivete, I don't like him, I don't like what he's doing.
There wasn't the kind of boyfriend that she would want to get involved with. There was going to be one or two things, trouble where she was going to end up in jail with him, by being caught by the police or being hurt really bad.
Mom, I knew you would say that.
I think she knew I wasn't going to be pleased with it.
It may have also been what attracted Davisha to a bad boy like Tracy in the first place.
She was naive in a sense because we had sheltered her so much. She hadn't been introduced to any of those things.
Young ladies that have been somewhat sheltered for so long, when they get a taste of freedom, that appeal of being with someone that I know my parents would not necessarily approve of can be very captivating. And so there can be this sort of adrenaline rush, or there can be this sort of thrill, whether it's the healthiest decision or not.
But while her parents didn't approve of Tracy, they tell detectives they didn't push Davisha to end the relationship.
I knew if I'd have stayed and harped on the situation, it was just going to push her closer to him. So I was trying to give her the time to see what was going on, wake up to what was going on.
Despite that, as her father predicted, Davisha had continued to see Tracy.
I think it strengthened their relationship at the time, and it actually became a us against them. I think that was the turning point in why he felt so comfortable with some of the behaviors that he demonstrated thereafter, because he had psychological control and emotional control over her at that point.
And now that Davisha is dead, her parents are convinced that they'd been right about Tracy.
Those parents did, I'm sure, what they thought was best at the time. Again, there were red flags.
I was considering death by somebody else hurting her, being caught up in crossfire with him some kind of way, It never came to me as him actually killing her.
But now you think he did.
Yes.
But why would he do that?
Because she finally came to her senses. She wanted to leave him.
I believe she told him that his honey hole had dried up. It's time for him to go.
They think Bullock was not willing to accept rejection, and he took things to the extreme.
I think that's exactly what happened. I go to the grave with that.
It's a compelling theory. Only there's one problem.
There was no evidence that Tracy had been violent or threatening toward Davisha.
But that all changes when the crime lab finally cracks the passcode on Davisha's phone.
She had everything in her phone with the ARG and everything else that was going on.
Hey, come here.
It's an indication that she knew that this was an issue. She knew that, like, this is an unsafe situation.
Look at this.
Because one video taken less than 48 hours before the murder showed Tracy with a gun.
It was Friday night, pointed toward her, you know.
You ain't gonna shoot?
Detectives investigating Davisha Harris's homicide have just uncovered what appears to be serious evidence against her boyfriend, Tracy Bullock, on Davisha's phone.
They found a video with Mr. Bullock pointing a gun at the victim.
Davisha had recorded the video less than 48 hours before her murder.
This absolutely demonstrates someone who was incredibly reckless, careless, impulsive, and honestly had no regard for Davisha's life. Even if the intent in that moment was not to pull the trigger, to put the gun in her face, that was an act to intimidate, an act to really incite fear.
But does that mean he'd eventually follow through on his threat?
Davisha's parents believe Tracy killed her because she told him she was going to leave him.
I believe she actually woke up and seen the light. She stepped to him and told him it was over, gone, where you gonna go or whatever.
When someone decides to leave an abusive relationship, that's when things are most dangerous.
For many abusers, experiencing that sense of lack of control can feel incredibly threatening for them. And that's when we see like the lashing out. That's when we see the very impulsive behaviors, things becoming physical, things becoming violent and aggressive.
Did that explain why Davisha recorded the incident?
She could have been thinking about needing evidence or documentation for a potential restraining order. Like if she had made up in her mind that this is it, I have to end this relationship. She could have been thinking very future focused. I'm going to have to put some things in place legally to protect myself. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about the fact that she had video.
Was it too little too late? For the moment, detectives are still far from proving it.
The case against Tracy was entirely circumstantial.
But it does get stronger when detectives receive the results of Davisha's autopsy and confirm the cause of death.
According to the medical examiner, it was a close contact wound to the head.
There's some stippling around the wound.
Stippling is where unburned powder strikes the skin around the gunshot wound.
That tells them that it was up close and personal.
Which isn't how Tracy described the shooting in his second statement.
He said Davisha was some distance behind him when he ducked out of the would-be assassin's way.
After the autopsy was done, all of those things just proved to be untrue.
Most important for investigators, the autopsy also recovers the bullet that killed Davisha.
If they can find a weapon, they can use that ballistic evidence to match it back to that gun.
The caliber of the bullet appeared to be from the same gun that Tracy had in the video, but without ballistics testing, detectives couldn't prove it was the same gun.
They can solve this case possibly with the circumstantial evidence that they have, but there's nothing like cold hard evidence, that smoking gun. So that's what they need to find.
Until they do, all Davisha's family can do is wait and gather to say goodbye.
A homegoing celebration. It was more people there that I'd never seen before in my life. I mean, the church was full.
I think our church at that time held like 400 or 500. It was full. We had chairs down the aisle.
There was not a seat vacant for anybody. Like, it was a full house. There were people in the aisles. There were people standing up in the back of the church.
And that just showed me that she was well loved and well respected. You know, only 19 years old, they have all these type of people showing up.
The outpouring of love for Davisha is little solace, knowing that the man they believe is her killer is yet to be charged with murder.
The amount of frustration and just pain and anger that they felt in that moment, I'm sure, was unbearable. It's like, no, this is the person who did this, a person who needs to be held accountable, like he's right here.
The guy took her life. The videos are self-explanatory.
You can actually see where he had the gun that Friday night.
But where was the gun now? Detectives are at a loss for where to begin their search.
At this point in the investigation, the detectives, they don't have that smoking gun. That's a key piece of evidence that's missing.
Fortunately, detectives won't have to search hard to find it.
All this time, Tracy was still in jail for the probation violation.
And that could prove his undoing after a cellmate of Tracy's at the Lamar County Jail reaches out to the detectives.
It's not uncommon for that to happen, and sometimes we just have good luck.
The informant said that while they shared a cell, Tracy had talked about Davisha's murder.
He's telling me about how he killed this girl.
He gives them a lot of information about the case. And some of the information is information only the person that did the murder would know.
Including what Tracy had done with the murder weapon.
Told me where he hid it.
A jailhouse informant has just told detectives that Tracy Bullock confessed to him all about how he'd killed his girlfriend, Davisha Harris.
He's in jail, telling his cellmate what he did and what he did with the murder weapon.
And this other inmate decided to talk to investigators and give them information. And the reason why he would want to do that is to possibly get some time off his own sentence.
It's a huge break in the case, if it's the truth.
Following up on the tip, detectives searched where the informant said Tracy had disposed of the gun.
And he gave the exact location where the gun would be.
It appeared to be a match for the gun Tracy had in Davisha's cell phone video.
But is it really the murder weapon?
When the crime lab compared the gun with the bullet recovered during Davisha's autopsy, it was a match.
It's news Davisha's family has been waiting to hear.
The investigators actually called us and told us they had found the weapon. They knew that he killed Davisha, so it was going to actually be murder.
As a detective, the best thing about this job is being able to come to them and give them that closure.
That sense of closure proved short-lived, however.
The prosecutor felt like the case wasn't strong enough for a murder conviction.
Rather than pursue murder charges, they offered Tracy the opportunity to plead to manslaughter.
Manslaughter is something that happened in the heat of the moment. It could be an argument, an altercation, which caused the suspect to kill the victim.
In other words, if you were in the heat of passion, again, just based on human being, human nature, you're not in your right mind.
Tracy takes the deal, admitting that he shot Davisha in the middle of an argument.
I'm done. You need to leave.
For what?
I'm done. I'm done with this and I'm done with you.
I ain't going nowhere.
Oh, okay. Big man with a gun.
Oh, you don't think I'll do it?
I know you won't.
He was someone that was spiraling. He was rapidly unraveling.
For Davicia's family, Tracy's plea deal is a slap in the face.
A lot of emotions was tied up. Anger, disappointment, just pain, you know. It was just unrealistic pain. It was like just almost living that heartache over again, that initial heartache.
When your loved one has been in a situation where they've had that person brandish a gun, threaten them when there's video footage to show it, it's kind of difficult to accept that he was just angry or jealous in the moment.
You took her life. And to me, in my opinion, it was premeditated.
At Tracy's sentencing hearing, Davicia's family makes it clear they consider the plea deal a travesty of justice.
They would read the impact statement to him of how we actually felt about it, about this whole situation. And he was just a little punk ass, too scared to even turn his head and look and listen. I told him, won't you turn your head, look at me while I'm talking to you, mother. But he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it.
He was sitting there shaking his dress and kind of laughing at us, you know, smiling at us, you know, like, I beat this case, you know, like, I've got over on y'all. Y'all not getting what y'all thought y'all was gonna get. You know what I'm saying? Because we will always think justice will be revealed.
Will a father's impassioned statement and Tracy's apparent contempt for the process have an impact on the judge?
The judge himself, he asked the DA 3 times, is this all you charge this man with all the evidence I see here? He asked the DA 3 times. DA said yes.
And in the end, the judge honors the terms of the plea and sentences Tracy to 15 years.
He was let off lightly, and it was not fair. I was very angry when I heard about it.
I have nothing for the legal system now, you know, it's just, they just let us down. It's like we didn't matter to them, that she didn't matter, and she does matter.
We're talking about a 19-year-old young lady who had her entire life ahead of her, who was just starting to really establish herself, really starting to understand what it even means to be independent and to be an adult, and to have her life senselessly taken away from her. I don't think she nor her family received justice.
He still gets to get out, create a family, and just live his life, and she wasn't able to do that.
The Harris family is going to be affected forever. Forever and ever.
I'm coping, day by day I'm coping, but you never forget it.
Although Davicia's parents do hope that her story will allow others to avoid a similar fate.
Someone starts to physically abuse you, verbally abuse you emotionally, you need to get out the relationship as fast as you can. Tell somebody.
When you see these red flags, when you see these warning signs, take them to heart.
Let somebody know, if it's not your parents or your siblings, somebody you respect that's older. Let them know so this situation won't happen again.
But they also see Davicia's story as a cautionary tale for parents.
Teach your child to always be mindful of the company they keep or the individual they want to date.
Her being naive played a part, not realizing what she was stepping into, the danger what she was stepping into.
Because what you lose can be more than any family can bear.
She's a sweet person. You know, it's truly missed by all.
She wasn't here for a long time, but she definitely left her mark.
And she was just love, that's all. She was love.
It is just after 3 a.m. in Tallahassee, Florida, and the air feels strangely still, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Inside a small student room at Florida State University, a young woman stirs awake. The darkness is thick, almost physical, pressing against the thin walls of the dormitory. For a moment, there is only silence. Then, a sound that does not belong here. A soft creak. Not loud enough to be certain. Not clear enough to justify panic. The kind of sound the mind tries to dismiss before fear has time to form. In the hallway, something moves. What happens in the next minutes will later be described in police reports, testimonies, and fragments of memory that never quite fit together cleanly. But in that moment, there is no narrative, no investigation, no name attached to the presence moving through the building. Only instinct. Only survival. And somewhere in that darkness, a man is walking with purpose. His name is Ted Bundy, though at this moment, he is not yet a headline, not yet a symbol of American fear. He is simply a shape in motion, passing through thresholds that were supposed to remain safe. Doors that should have stayed locked. Lives that should have remained untouched. What makes this moment so disturbing is not only what he does, but how ordinary everything around him appears. A campus that looks like any other campus. A dormitory that looks like any other dormitory. A night that began like any other night. Until it didn't. Long before this night, there were already patterns forming, like faint scratches on glass that only become visible when light hits them at the right angle. In the early 1970s, across Washington, Utah, and Colorado, young women began to disappear. At first, each case looked isolated, unconnected, almost random. A student who never returned home. A car left in a parking lot with no explanation. A phone call that was never answered again. The idea that all of it could be the work of a single individual felt too large, too improbable to hold. That is often how the most dangerous patterns survive in plain sight. Back in the dormitory, the hallway light flickers once, then steadies. A door latch shifts. Somewhere down the corridor, a footstep pauses, as if listening. Not rushing. Not panicked. Controlled. Patient. The kind of presence that does not break into chaos, but instead moves through it like it belongs there. This is what investigators would later struggle to reconcile. The contrast between the image and the reality. Between the man who could speak with confidence, charm, even warmth, and the violence that seemed to follow him like a second shadow. In earlier years, Bundy had appeared almost unremarkable in the conventional sense of evil. He studied law. He worked in political environments. He volunteered in campaigns. He knew how to shake hands without hesitation, how to hold eye contact just long enough to create trust, how to make people feel as though they had known him longer than they actually had. There was nothing in that version of him that would make a stranger step away in fear. And that, perhaps, was the most important part. Because predators who rely on fear are easy to avoid. Predators who rely on trust are not. As the night deepens in Tallahassee, the first signs of chaos begin not with loud violence, but with absence. A light left on in a room where no one returns. A bed that has not been slept in. A hallway that feels slightly emptier than it should. Then, slowly, realization begins to spread. One room. Then another. A pattern of missing presence. Of interrupted lives. Outside, the campus is still asleep. Cars sit motionless in parking lots. Trees sway gently under the weight of humidity. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticks forward without urgency, unaware that time is about to become something different for many people at once. In the hours that follow, confusion will turn into fear. Fear will turn into urgency. And urgency will collide with the first stages of investigation, as authorities try to understand what exactly has entered their jurisdiction, and how something like this could happen inside a space meant for learning, growth, and safety. But none of that clarity exists yet. Right now, there is only the aftermath of intrusion. Doors discovered ajar. Rooms discovered empty. A silence that feels heavier than noise ever could. And the unsettling realization that whatever happened here did not announce itself. It arrived quietly. Which, for those who will later study these events, will become one of the most haunting characteristics of all. Because when violence is loud, it is remembered differently. It is processed through shock, through immediate fear, through obvious rupture. But when it is quiet, when it blends into the ordinary rhythm of a night, it creates a different kind of memory. One that lingers. One that questions itself. One that asks, over and over again, how it was not seen sooner. At the center of this unfolding crisis, whether anyone knows it yet or not, is a man who has already crossed boundaries that should have been impossible to cross unnoticed. A man whose ability to appear harmless has become his most effective tool. A man whose presence does not disrupt the world around him until it is far too late. And in the coming hours, as investigators begin to piece together fragments of what has happened, they will realize something even more disturbing than the events themselves. They are not looking for a stranger. They are looking for someone who, in many different ways, has already been seen before. Just never correctly understood. This is where the story truly begins. Not with the first disappearance. Not with the first report. But with the moment when the illusion of normality finally starts to break, and the shape of something far more calculated begins to emerge from the dark. The night air in Tallahassee still feels heavy, but by now it is no longer silent in the way it was before. Silence has changed shape. It is no longer calm. It is interrupted, fractured, broken into pieces by movement, confusion, and the slow realization that something is wrong inside the dormitory buildings of Florida State University. In the early hours following the first reports of missing students, the campus begins to transform. Not suddenly, but in waves. First comes confusion, then disbelief, and finally something sharper, fear that spreads through hallways, stairwells, and phone calls that cannot quite stay calm. Somewhere inside that unfolding panic, the name Ted Bundy does not yet carry its full weight in public consciousness. To many, he is still an idea too distant to fully grasp, even as fragments of his actions begin to surface like broken glass under dim light. What happened in those rooms, in those hallways, is still being reconstructed, still being questioned, still resisting full understanding. But what investigators are beginning to see is not random chaos. It is structure, pattern, intent. And that is what makes it terrifying. Earlier that night, the dormitories had looked ordinary. Students studying late, radios playing softly behind closed doors, the faint smell of laundry detergent and cafeteria food lingering in the air. Nothing about the building suggested it would become the center of one of the most disturbing crime scenes in recent American memory. Yet somewhere within that ordinary environment, an intrusion occurred that did not announce itself with noise or spectacle. It moved quietly, almost politely, as if it belonged there. By the time the first police units arrive, the atmosphere has already changed. Flashing lights spill across the pavement outside the residence halls, painting the brick walls in alternating colors of red and blue. Officers move quickly but carefully, their radios crackling with fragmented updates. Students stand outside in small groups, wrapped in blankets or jackets, watching their own lives being reorganized without permission. There is a kind of disbelief in their faces that cannot yet accept permanence. The idea that something irreversible has happened inside a place so familiar is still too large to process. Inside the building, the scene is even harder to define. Rooms are not destroyed in the way people expect from violent crime. There is no obvious explosion of chaos, no immediate visual confirmation that something catastrophic has taken place. Instead, there is absence. Missing presence. Doors that should have been opened again, but are not. Personal items left in places that suggest interruption rather than departure. For investigators, this absence is more unsettling than visible destruction. Because it suggests control. It suggests time. It suggests that whoever was responsible did not act in haste, but in calculation. As the early search expands, officers begin to piece together a timeline that does not yet make emotional sense. Students recall hearing faint noises. A distant sound in the hallway. A door that may have closed a little too softly. A shadow that might have been mistaken for a roommate returning late. Nothing concrete enough to anchor certainty. Everything just ambiguous enough to delay alarm. And that ambiguity is what allowed events to unfold without immediate interruption. Outside Florida, similar patterns have been studied in earlier cases from Washington, Utah, and Colorado. Missing women. Unresolved disappearances. Witness accounts that describe a man who appeared injured, or in need of help, or who presented himself as an authority figure. Each account, taken alone, seems incomplete. Together, they begin to form something far more coherent. A method. A strategy built not on force alone, but on perception. Before these events in Florida, Bundy had already demonstrated an ability to exploit the most fundamental human instinct, the tendency to trust what appears familiar. A cast on an arm. A polite tone. A request for assistance. A moment that feels too ordinary to be dangerous. That is what made him effective. Not invisibility, but believability. As investigators in Tallahassee begin speaking with witnesses, they are confronted by a recurring difficulty. People are not describing a monster. They are describing a man who, at least at first glance, did not fit their expectations of danger. Someone who could stand in a public space without immediately triggering alarm. Someone who could pass through social environments without disruption. That contradiction becomes one of the central tensions of the case. Because the human mind struggles to reconcile two opposing truths, that someone can appear normal and still commit acts that are profoundly abnormal. As dawn approaches, the campus remains in a state of suspended shock. The sun rises slowly over Florida, casting long, pale light across parking lots still filled with emergency vehicles. The night's tension does not disappear with daylight. Instead, it becomes more visible, more defined. Inside command centers, investigators begin organizing information. Timelines are compared. Witness statements are cross-checked. Physical evidence is carefully catalogued. Every detail matters, even the smallest inconsistency, because at this stage, the case is not yet about conclusions. It is about reconstruction. Meanwhile, families begin to arrive. They do not arrive with answers. They arrive with questions that cannot be easily spoken. Names are confirmed or unconfirmed. Phone calls are made and remade. Doors are opened and closed in waiting rooms that feel too quiet for what they contain. The emotional weight of uncertainty becomes its own kind of pressure. It fills spaces that evidence has not yet clarified. In the middle of this developing investigation, a critical realization begins to emerge among law enforcement teams. This is not a single location crime. It is not confined to one building or one night. It is part of a broader trajectory that stretches across years and states, connecting incidents that were once treated as separate. And as that realization takes shape, so does the understanding that the person responsible has already been able to operate across jurisdictions, crossing borders of geography and assumption without being stopped. The name Bundy, once just one of many in earlier reports, begins to reappear in conversations with increasing frequency. Not yet with certainty, but with recognition. A pattern is forming too clearly to ignore. And in that recognition lies the beginning of something more structured than confusion, the first true outline of an investigation that will soon extend far beyond Florida, far beyond campus boundaries, and into a national pursuit. But for now, in these early hours, nothing is resolved. There are only fragments. Rooms that feel too quiet. Witnesses trying to remember details that slip away when spoken aloud. Officers trying to separate coincidence from connection. And an entire campus trying to understand how something so ordinary could have contained something so devastating without anyone noticing in time. The story is no longer about a single night. It is about everything that led to it. And everything that will follow. In the aftermath of the first confirmed disappearances, what investigators quickly realize is that this case cannot be understood through the lens of a single building, a single night, or even a single city. The deeper they look, the more the story expands outward, stretching across years, across states, and across the fragile lives of young women who were never meant to be connected in this way. To understand what happened, they must first understand who was targeted. Not as statistics, not as entries in a report, but as human beings who existed fully before their lives were interrupted. Most of the victims shared a pattern that, in hindsight, feels painfully visible. They were young women, many of them students, living lives defined by routine and ambition. They walked across campuses with books pressed to their chests, worked part-time jobs after class, called their families on weekends, and planned futures that felt stable and reachable. They were not isolated. They were not hidden. They were present in the world in a way that made their absence later feel even more unbearable. What made them vulnerable was not a single trait, but a combination of circumstance and timing. Busy campuses where strangers blended easily into the background. Parking lots at night where footsteps echoed without attention. Libraries and public spaces where trust was assumed rather than questioned. These were environments built on openness, and it was precisely that openness that created opportunity for someone like Ted Bundy. Bundy did not approach his victims as a figure of immediate threat. That is what made his actions so difficult to detect in real time. He did not rely on panic. He relied on familiarity. Witnesses in multiple states later described encounters that, at first glance, seemed ordinary. A man asking for help carrying books. A stranger with his arm in a sling, looking for assistance reaching his car. A voice that was calm, even polite, asking simple questions that did not immediately raise alarm. There is a particular cruelty in this method, not because it is loud, but because it is quiet enough to bypass instinct. The human brain is designed to detect obvious danger. It is less effective at identifying danger that mirrors normality. Many victims were last seen in moments that, to outside observers, would have seemed insignificant. Walking toward a parking lot. Leaving a library desk. Pausing briefly to speak with someone who did not appear threatening. These were not dramatic exits from safety. They were transitions that, at the time, did not feel like transitions at all. And that is what investigators would later struggle with most. The absence of a clear breaking point. No single moment where alarm definitively replaced normalcy. Instead, there was continuity. One of the most haunting aspects of reconstructing these cases is how ordinary the final known moments often were. A conversation that lasted too long to feel suspicious, but too short to be memorable. A decision to help someone who seemed to need assistance. A glance away for just long enough to lose visual contact. In the minds of family members, these details become fixed points. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are the last pieces of a life that can no longer continue forward. A daughter leaving a dorm room with plans to return later that night. A student mentioning future exams, weekend plans, a phone call that would never come. The emotional weight of these disappearances does not begin with discovery. It begins with waiting. Waiting for a call that does not arrive. Waiting for a knock at the door that never comes. Waiting for a return that slowly shifts from expected to uncertain to impossible. That transition is not immediate. It unfolds in stages, each one more difficult than the last, until hope itself becomes something fragile enough to hurt. As the investigation expands, patterns begin to emerge across different locations. Washington, Utah, Colorado, and eventually Florida are no longer separate contexts. They become part of a single, disturbing map of movement. Each point on that map represents not just an event, but a life interrupted under similar circumstances. What connects these cases is not only geography, but behavior. The way victims were approached. The way trust was gained quickly and efficiently. The way control was established without immediate force being visible to bystanders. In psychological profiles later developed by investigators, Bundy is often described in terms that attempt to capture this contradiction. Charismatic yet detached. Engaging yet calculating. Capable of blending into social environments, while simultaneously treating those environments as opportunities for selection. But in the field, during the actual investigations, those clinical descriptions feel distant compared to the raw reality of what families and officers were confronting. The absence of bodies in early stages of some cases created a different kind of uncertainty. Without physical confirmation, hope and fear existed side by side, refusing to resolve into one another. When evidence eventually began to surface in certain locations, it did not bring immediate clarity. Instead, it brought fragmentation. Partial remains. Incomplete timelines. Conflicting witness memories. Each new piece added information, but also expanded the number of unanswered questions. This is one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of serial crimes. They do not resolve cleanly. They accumulate. As investigators worked through victimology profiles, a clearer picture of vulnerability began to form. Many of the women were independent, mobile, and socially active. They moved freely through public spaces. They were not isolated in ways that would typically be associated with risk. And yet, it was precisely this normal mobility that placed them in environments where someone like Bundy could operate effectively. He did not need isolation. He needed access. And access was everywhere. In hindsight, survivors and witnesses often revisit their memories with a sense of disquiet. Moments that once seemed unremarkable begin to feel different under the weight of what is now known. A brief interaction that lasted a few minutes longer than expected. A feeling of discomfort that was dismissed at the time because nothing overtly threatening had occurred. This retrospective reinterpretation is common in cases involving manipulation. The mind, when faced with incomplete information, tends to normalize ambiguity. Only later does that ambiguity become visible as potential warning. For the families of victims, however, there is no such analytical distance. There is only the permanent gap between what was and what could have been. The future that was interrupted does not remain abstract. It becomes sharply defined in its absence. Graduations that never happened. Careers that never began. Conversations that will never continue. As the scope of Bundy's actions became clearer, investigators were forced to confront the unsettling reality that traditional assumptions about danger were insufficient. The idea that threats are always visible, always obvious, and always socially marked proved dangerously incomplete. Bundy operated within the blind spots of that assumption. And those blind spots were not rare. They were embedded in everyday life. By the time his movements reached Florida, the scale of his activity had already expanded beyond what early investigators had imagined possible. Yet even then, each new incident was initially processed locally, as an isolated crisis rather than part of a larger pattern. It took time, evidence sharing, and cross-jurisdictional communication before the full scope began to emerge. That delay, those gaps between recognition and connection, are part of what allowed the case to grow so extensively. But behind every investigative timeline, behind every map and report and profile, the central truth remains rooted in the victims themselves. Not in how they were categorized later, but in who they were before they became part of a case file. Students, daughters, friends, people moving through the world with expectations of continuity. Their stories do not begin with violence. They begin with normal life. And it is precisely that normal life that makes what happened to them so difficult to comprehend, even after every detail has been examined. Because nothing about their final moments was separated from the world they lived in. It was, instead, embedded within it.by the time the events in Florida reached their most violent point. The city of Tallahassee is no longer simply a backdrop. It has become an unwitting stage, where something already in motion finally collides with consequences that can no longer be delayed or contained. The sense of normal campus life, which once filled the dormitories of Florida State University, has been fractured beyond repair. In the early morning hours, when most of the city is still suspended between sleep and waking, the boundaries between safety and vulnerability collapse in ways no one inside those buildings can fully recognize in real time. Doors that should have remained closed do not hold the way they are expected to. Hallways that should have been quiet remain vulnerable to movement that does not belong. Inside this fragile architecture of everyday life, the presence of Ted Bundy becomes the force that turns routine into irreversible consequence. What makes this moment so difficult to comprehend, even for investigators later reconstructing it, is how ordinary everything still appears at the beginning. There is no announcement of danger, no dramatic shift in atmosphere that clearly signals what is about to unfold. Instead, there is continuity. The same dormitory corridors. The same sleeping rooms. The same late-night silence that students had experienced countless times before. But within that silence, movement begins. It is not chaotic. It is controlled. Deliberate. The kind of movement that does not rush against time, but uses it. Every action appears measured, as if the environment itself has already been studied in advance. Doors are approached with awareness of their structure. Hallways are navigated without hesitation. The darkness is not a barrier, but a condition that has already been accounted for. At this stage, the incident is not yet understood as an event. It is still a sequence of isolated moments, each one too small to immediately define the whole. In one room, a student stirs slightly, disturbed by a sound that does not fully register as threat. In another, someone turns over in sleep, unaware that the boundary between safety and intrusion has already been crossed. The building continues to breathe in its own rhythm, unaware that something foreign has entered its system. What follows is not a sudden explosion of violence, but a progressive tightening of control over space and presence. The kind of control that does not rely on noise, but on proximity. The closer the intrusion becomes, the more difficult it is to distinguish it from ordinary movement within the building itself. Investigators would later struggle with this aspect of the case. There was no single point of dramatic entry that could be easily isolated as the beginning. Instead, there were overlapping moments, each one blending into the next, forming a chain that only becomes visible in hindsight. Inside the dormitory, the architecture itself plays a silent role. Long corridors reduce visibility. Shared spaces allow unfamiliar presence to go unnoticed for longer than expected. The natural trust of a residential environment, where not every face is constantly questioned, becomes part of the vulnerability that is exploited. At some point during the incident, control shifts from potential to actual. A threshold is crossed that cannot be reversed. It is not marked by spectacle, but by certainty. The environment, once neutral, becomes compromised. For those who later try to reconstruct what happened inside these rooms, the difficulty lies not only in what was done, but in how quickly it became impossible to undo. Moments that should have remained separate begin to merge. Time becomes compressed. Memory becomes fragmented. Some students later recall faint impressions rather than clear sequences. A presence where there should not have been one. A sense of being awake too suddenly, without understanding why. The feeling of something being wrong, before there is language available to describe what that wrongness is. In these fragmented recollections, there is a consistent pattern of confusion rather than clarity. The mind resists immediate comprehension of danger when it does not arrive in a recognizable form. Instead of alarm, there is often hesitation. Instead of immediate reaction, there is delay. That delay becomes decisive. As the incident progresses, the dormitory ceases to function as a place of rest and becomes instead a space of disorientation. Boundaries that normally separate private and public space lose their clarity. Rooms that were once safe become uncertain. Hallways that were once familiar no longer guarantee predictability. At the center of this unfolding disruption is Bundy's ability to maintain control without drawing immediate attention. His presence does not rely on forceful visibility. It relies on timing and perception. Each action is positioned within gaps where recognition has not yet fully formed. This is where the psychological dimension of the event becomes as important as the physical one. Fear does not always appear instantly. It develops in stages, especially when the mind is still attempting to reconcile what it is perceiving with what it expects to be true. Inside that gap between perception and understanding, the incident expands. By the time any form of resistance or alarm begins to emerge, the situation has already moved beyond its initial phase. The environment has already been altered. The sense of normality has already been displaced. What remains is a sequence of reactions occurring within a space that no longer behaves predictably. Outside the building, the world continues unaware for a critical period of time. Cars pass through nearby streets. Lights remain on in distant buildings. The city functions as if nothing has changed. That separation between internal crisis and external normality is part of what makes the event so disorienting in retrospect. When the first clear signs of emergency begin to surface, they do so unevenly. Not all at once, but in fragments. A call for help. A discovered absence. A realization that something is wrong in a specific room. Each piece arrives independently before being connected into a larger picture. Emergency response begins to form in real time, but without full understanding of scale or scope. Officers arrive expecting a contained situation, only to find that the situation does not conform to simple boundaries. What appears at first to be an isolated incident quickly reveals layers of complexity that extend beyond initial assumptions. Inside the dormitory, the process of discovery begins to replace the process of occurrence. The incident itself is no longer unfolding. It has already happened in key areas. What remains is the aftermath in its earliest form: confusion, search, and the attempt to account for presence and absence within the same space. The emotional impact on those who encounter the scene first is not immediate clarity, but disorientation. The human mind resists full comprehension when faced with something that contradicts expectations of safety in such an environment. That resistance slows understanding, even as urgency increases. As information begins to circulate among responders, a troubling realization takes shape. This is not an isolated disruption. It is part of a pattern that extends beyond what is immediately visible. The incident is not contained within a single room, or even a single floor. It is part of a larger trajectory that has already been unfolding elsewhere. That realization changes everything about how the situation is approached. It transforms a local emergency into something that carries broader implications, both in terms of investigation and in terms of public understanding. And yet, even as that larger context begins to form, the immediate reality remains grounded in individual human experience. People trying to understand what has happened. People trying to locate those who are missing. People trying to make sense of a space that no longer behaves according to expectation. In the center of all this, the presence of Bundy is no longer just theoretical or historical. It is operational. It is active. It is the force that has shaped the conditions of the incident itself. But even as that recognition begins to emerge, it is already too late to change what has been set in motion. The incident has already reached its conclusion phase. What follows will no longer be about what is happening inside the dormitory, but about what is discovered afterward, and how those discoveries will reshape everything that investigators believed they understood up to this point. By the time the first wave of officers fully understands the scale of what they have walked into, the scene inside the Florida State University dormitory has already begun to change in subtle but irreversible ways. Not because anything is being altered deliberately, but because time itself is beginning to erase the clarity of the first moments of discovery. Footsteps multiply in the hallway. Radios crackle with overlapping voices. Doors that were once closed are now open, and spaces that were once private are being carefully transformed into controlled zones of observation. What the investigators are trying to preserve is not just evidence, but the exact emotional and physical condition of a moment that has already started to slip away from its original form. Inside one of the dorm sections, a room stands out immediately. It is not visibly destroyed in the way people often imagine violent crime scenes. There is no obvious spectacle of chaos. Instead, there is disruption in placement, in stillness, in the absence of expected order. A chair is slightly turned at an angle that suggests interruption. Personal belongings are no longer where they should naturally be. A bed remains unmade in a way that feels unfinished rather than routine. It is this kind of detail that trained investigators notice first. Not dramatic evidence, but deviation from normal rhythm. As forensic teams begin their careful entry, the atmosphere shifts again. What had been urgency outside becomes precision inside. Every movement is deliberate now. Nothing is rushed. Every surface is treated as a potential source of information. The goal is not to interpret yet, but to preserve. The presence of Ted Bundy in the broader narrative of these events is not immediately visible in physical form, but investigators are already beginning to consider whether the patterns they are observing align with earlier documented cases linked to him. At this stage, however, they are not working with certainty. They are working with fragments. A key challenge in the early discovery phase is the separation of emotional reaction from investigative procedure. Officers who first entered the building describe a sense of cognitive dissonance. The environment looks familiar in structure, yet completely unfamiliar in implication. Dormitory architecture, normally associated with safety and routine student life, is now reinterpreted as a complex spatial puzzle that must be carefully reconstructed. Rooms are documented one by one. Hallways are photographed from multiple angles. Entry points are examined with particular attention to anything that might indicate forced access or manipulation of routine movement. Even the smallest inconsistencies become important. A door that does not fully latch, a window that appears slightly disturbed, a pattern of movement that does not match expected use of space. As investigators move deeper into the building, they begin to identify areas where activity appears to have concentrated. These are not necessarily obvious at first glance, but emerge through comparison. One room shows signs of sudden interruption. Another shows evidence that suggests brief struggle or rapid movement through space. The pattern is not chaotic, but directional. This directional quality becomes one of the most important early insights. It suggests intent. Outside the immediate rooms of interest, the dormitory continues to function as both crime scene and living environment. This duality creates tension in the investigation. Students who were not directly involved are still present in adjacent areas, being carefully relocated for safety and clarity. Their presence serves as a reminder that this is not an isolated environment sealed off from life, but a space where ordinary routine has been abruptly interrupted. In the corridor, investigators find subtle traces that begin to form a timeline. A footprint pattern that suggests movement at a specific pace. A door handle with partial disturbance that indicates contact under unusual circumstances. A personal item misplaced in a way that suggests sudden departure rather than voluntary placement. Each detail on its own is minor. Together, they begin to form structure. One of the most significant challenges at this stage is distinguishing between what belongs to the normal life of the dormitory and what belongs to the intrusion that occurred within it. Dormitory environments are inherently messy in a way that complicates forensic clarity. Students move frequently between rooms, leave items temporarily, and interact with shared spaces in ways that create overlapping patterns of behavior. Against that background noise, investigators must identify anomalies that are not immediately obvious. Inside one particular section, a discovery begins to shift the tone of the entire investigation. It is not a dramatic reveal, but a convergence of small indicators that together suggest a single, coordinated sequence of events rather than multiple unrelated incidents. This is where the case begins to move from confusion toward structure. Communication between responding teams increases. Information is shared more rapidly. Preliminary hypotheses begin to circulate, though none are yet confirmed. The possibility that the perpetrator may be linked to previous incidents outside Florida begins to gain more serious consideration. References to earlier cases associated with Bundy's name are not yet definitive conclusions, but they are no longer distant speculation either. They are becoming part of active investigative dialogue. What makes this stage particularly difficult is the gap between what is known and what is suspected. Evidence suggests coordination and familiarity with environment. Behavioral patterns suggest prior experience. But direct confirmation is still absent. Investigators are working at the edge of incomplete understanding. As daylight continues to spread across the campus, the external environment becomes increasingly active. News of the incident begins to move beyond the university. Law enforcement coordination expands. Additional personnel are called in to assist with containment, documentation, and analysis. The dormitory, once a residential space, is now fully converted into an active investigative site. Within this controlled chaos, the emotional impact on those involved begins to surface more visibly. Officers who entered early stages of the scene carry expressions of restrained disbelief. There is a noticeable shift in how they move through space, as if every step must now account not only for procedure, but for the weight of what they are witnessing. Families who arrive at the perimeter are kept at a distance, but their presence is felt in the atmosphere surrounding the investigation. Waiting becomes its own form of tension, suspended between hope and fear without resolution. Inside the building, as evidence continues to be catalogued, a clearer narrative begins to emerge. It is not yet complete, but it is no longer fragmented in the same way. Certain pathways of movement can now be traced with more confidence. Certain rooms can be connected in sequence. The incident begins to take the shape of a timeline rather than isolated points. Still, critical questions remain unanswered. Entry and exit routes are not fully confirmed. The exact sequence of interactions is still being reconstructed. And the identity of the perpetrator, while increasingly suspected, is not yet officially anchored within the evidence being processed on site. What is becoming clear, however, is that the event cannot be understood in isolation from earlier patterns across multiple states. The behavioral consistency observed here aligns too closely with known characteristics from previous investigations linked to Bundy. His method of operating within perceived safety zones, his ability to blend into environments without immediate detection, and his strategic use of trust as an entry mechanism are all elements that investigators now recognize in the structure of what has occurred. But recognition does not yet equal resolution. At this stage of discovery, the investigation exists in a fragile balance. Too much interpretation risks error. Too little interpretation risks missing the larger connection. Every detail must be held in tension, examined repeatedly, and placed within evolving context. As the day progresses, the dormitory scene becomes less about discovery in the immediate sense and more about reconstruction. The initial shock of entry gives way to systematic documentation. The focus shifts from what is visibly present to what can be logically inferred. And in that shift, the reality of the situation begins to solidify. Something calculated has occurred within this space. Something that did not rely on randomness, but on understanding of environment, timing, and human behavior. The investigation is no longer asking whether something serious happened. It is now trying to understand exactly how it was allowed to happen, within a place that was supposed to prevent it entirely. By the time the investigation formally expands, beyond the immediate dormitory response, the case has already begun to shift from a localized crisis into something far more complex and unstable. What was once treated as an isolated intrusion inside a university residence hall is now being reclassified, discussed in briefing rooms, not only in Tallahassee, but in coordination channels that extend across state lines. The central problem investigators face is no longer simply what happened inside Florida State University, but who is capable of moving through multiple environments with enough confidence and consistency to produce the same kind of disruption in different places without immediate detection. In early meetings, the name Ted Bundy begins to surface not as a conclusion, but as a reference point. A comparison. A pattern match. Not yet a confirmed identity behind the Florida incident, but a psychological and behavioral framework that seems increasingly difficult to ignore. What makes the investigation so difficult at this stage is not the lack of information, but the fragmentation of it. There is too much detail in some areas and almost none in others. Witness statements conflict in timing. Physical evidence suggests movement, but not always direction. Entry points are unclear. Exit routes are even more uncertain. Investigators begin by attempting to stabilize the timeline. The first priority is to separate confirmed facts from assumption. When did the intrusion begin? How long did it last? How many individuals were involved? Which rooms were accessed, and in what sequence? But every answer seems to create another layer of uncertainty. Inside command coordination rooms, maps of the dormitory are covered with markers and handwritten notes. Lines connect points of interest that may or may not represent actual movement. Each line is tentative, subject to revision. Nothing is finalized because nothing is fully verified. One of the earliest confirmed challenges is the inconsistency of witness perception. Students who were present in adjacent areas recall fragments of sound or movement, but those fragments do not align cleanly. One person remembers footsteps in a hallway. Another remembers a door closing at a time that does not match the first account. A third recalls seeing a figure, but cannot confidently describe direction or purpose. This kind of uncertainty is not unusual in high-stress environments, but in this case, it significantly complicates reconstruction. As investigators widen their scope, they begin to incorporate external case files from other states. Reports from Washington, Utah, and Colorado are pulled into the same analytical framework. Patterns begin to emerge not in isolation, but in comparison. A recurring behavioral structure becomes visible. A method of approach that relies on deception rather than force. A preference for environments where trust is assumed. A tendency to operate in transitional spaces, such as parking lots, building entrances, and public walkways. These elements begin to align too closely to be dismissed as coincidence. Even without definitive proof linking the Florida incident to earlier cases, the similarities force investigators to consider a broader possibility that they are dealing with a mobile offender capable of adapting behavior to different environments while maintaining consistent psychological strategy. Within that discussion, Bundy's name becomes unavoidable. Not as a confirmed suspect in the Florida case at this point, but as a known historical reference for similar behavioral patterns. His earlier crimes provide a template for understanding how such mobility and deception can function across jurisdictions without immediate detection. What investigators are now trying to determine is whether the same level of behavioral sophistication is present in the current case, and if so, how it was sustained without interruption. One of the key difficulties in constructing a reliable investigative narrative is the absence of a clear beginning. In traditional cases, there is often a defined point of entry, a moment that marks the transition from normalcy to crime. In this situation, that boundary is blurred. The environment itself provides too many overlapping opportunities for unnoticed movement. Dormitory access is not strictly controlled during late hours in the same way as more secure facilities. Students enter and exit at irregular intervals. Visitors may be present without immediate scrutiny. These conditions create a level of ambient ambiguity that can obscure precise timing. Investigators must therefore rely heavily on indirect indicators. Elevator logs. Door access records. Light activity patterns. Phone records from witnesses who may have unknowingly captured relevant timing data. Each piece is small on its own, but together they begin to suggest a narrower window of activity than initially believed. At the same time, forensic analysis inside the dormitory continues to develop. Trace evidence is carefully collected from multiple locations. The goal is to identify not only presence, but sequence. Which areas were accessed first? Which pathways were used repeatedly? Which surfaces show signs of contact that do not match normal residential behavior? This process is slow and meticulous. Every sample must be preserved, labeled, and cross-referenced. Any error at this stage could compromise later reconstruction. As the physical evidence is analyzed, behavioral profiling teams begin constructing an operational model of the intruder. This model does not attempt to identify a specific individual at first. Instead, it focuses on capabilities and patterns. The intruder appears to have familiarity with social environments that allow close proximity to strangers without immediate suspicion. There is evidence of adaptability in approach methods, suggesting prior experience in navigating unpredictable human responses. There is also a notable absence of impulsive behavior in the available indicators. Actions appear structured rather than reactive. This combination of traits raises the level of concern significantly, because it implies not only intent, but refinement. During this phase, comparisons to known offenders become more structured. The behavioral profile begins to resemble documented cases of offenders who rely on interpersonal manipulation rather than overt aggression. It is within this analytical space that Bundy's historical case becomes increasingly relevant as a reference model. Investigators review how earlier incidents attributed to him demonstrated similar reliance on situational trust, environmental familiarity, and controlled interaction. The emphasis is not on identity confirmation, but on pattern resonance. However, even as these comparisons grow stronger, caution remains essential. Premature alignment of cases can lead to investigative bias. Every similarity must be weighed against the possibility of coincidence or alternative explanation. Meanwhile, pressure from external sources begins to increase. Media attention expands as details of the Florida incident become more widely known. Public concern rises, particularly among university communities across multiple states. Law enforcement agencies face the dual challenge of continuing investigation while managing information flow. Inside the investigative teams, fatigue begins to accumulate. Long hours of review, combined with the emotional weight of the case, create an environment where focus must be constantly maintained. Small details become critical, but also easy to overlook under pressure. Despite this, progress is made in narrowing the timeline further. A more precise window of activity is established, reducing uncertainty around when the intrusion likely occurred. This refinement allows investigators to cross-check additional data sources that were previously considered secondary. Surveillance footage from surrounding campus areas is re-examined with greater attention to subtle movement patterns. Vehicle logs are reviewed for anomalies. Even weather conditions are considered, as environmental factors can influence visibility and witness perception. Gradually, the case begins to move from fragmented uncertainty toward structured analysis. But even as clarity increases in some areas, the central question remains unresolved. The identity of the individual responsible has not been officially confirmed. The behavioral alignment with known cases suggests possibility, but not proof. And within that uncertainty lies the most important investigative tension, the need to distinguish between pattern recognition and evidentiary confirmation. As the investigation continues to evolve, one fact becomes increasingly clear. The Florida incident is not an isolated anomaly. It is part of a broader investigative challenge that spans multiple jurisdictions, multiple years, and multiple behavioral patterns that now appear to converge. Whether or not the same individual is responsible across all cases is still under examination. But the structure of the behavior being studied has already begun to reshape how investigators understand mobility, deception, and vulnerability in environments previously assumed to be safe. And at the center of that evolving understanding remains a single unsettling possibility: that the true scope of what occurred has not yet been fully revealed, and may only become clear as each layer of the investigation continues to unfold. The breakthrough did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It did not explode into the investigation with certainty or finality. Instead, it emerged in fragments, scattered across different teams working different angles, each unaware, at first, that their separate findings were beginning to converge toward the same point. 4 days after the Florida State University dormitory incident, investigators had been operating in a state of controlled uncertainty. They had evidence, but not coherence. They had patterns, but not identity. They had direction, but not confirmation. And in the middle of that unstable balance, every new piece of information had the potential either to clarify the case or to complicate it further. Then, slowly, something changed. It began with a vehicle description. Multiple witnesses, interviewed separately, began to recall a similar detail. A young man. A car parked in a position that seemed unremarkable at first, but later felt out of place. The color varied slightly in each account, as did the timing, but there was a consistency in the structure of the memory that drew attention. Not the exact image, but the presence of something that did not belong. In investigative work, repetition across independent memory is rarely ignored. Even when details are imperfect, convergence matters. At the same time, across state lines, earlier case files were being re-examined with renewed urgency. Reports from Washington, Utah, and Colorado, once separated by geography and time, were now being placed side by side in a way that revealed patterns that had previously remained partially obscured. A profile was beginning to take shape not just of behavior, but of movement. And within that growing structure, the name Ted Bundy moved from comparative reference to active investigative focus. What had once been used as a behavioral analogy was now being considered as a real-world connection point. Not because of assumption, but because of accumulation. Too many similarities across too many incidents to ignore the possibility that they were not separate cases at all, but parts of a single trajectory. The turning point came when law enforcement in Florida coordinated more directly with investigators in Utah. A vehicle associated with a suspect of interest had been flagged in connection with prior suspicious activity. The description matched fragments of what witnesses in Florida had reported, but more importantly, it aligned with movement patterns that had already been documented elsewhere. A surveillance network, still in its early stages compared to modern standards, began to piece together movement data from toll records, patrol observations, and public reports. What emerged was not a continuous, fully documented path, but a series of points that suggested deliberate travel rather than random displacement. The suspect was not stationary. He was moving with purpose. And that realization shifted the entire investigative posture. Instead of asking what happened inside one dormitory, investigators now began asking where else similar behavior had occurred within the same time frame. The case was no longer anchored to a single location. It was expanding outward, connecting environments that had previously been treated as unrelated. In parallel, forensic analysis from the Florida scene began to produce results that strengthened the connection further. Trace evidence collected from the dormitory environment revealed biological material that could be cross-referenced with existing records. While technology at the time did not allow for the precision available today, even limited forensic comparison was enough to narrow possibilities. More compelling than any single piece of physical evidence, however, was the pattern of interaction between perpetrator and environment. The way entry points had been used suggested familiarity with residential layouts. The way movement had occurred through shared spaces suggested confidence rather than hesitation. And the way the incident concluded suggested not interruption, but completion. Investigators began to see that they were not dealing with an opportunistic act confined to Florida. They were dealing with a behavioral system that had been deployed repeatedly in different contexts. Then came the identification moment that would become central to the breakthrough narrative. A survivor from an earlier, unrelated but similar incident in another state provided a detailed description that, when compared with photographic records and compiled witness sketches, produced a convergence that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The description was not perfect, but it was consistent in structure, facial features, mannerisms, voice tone, and behavioral cues. When this information was placed alongside existing suspect files, the alignment became increasingly difficult to ignore. At that stage, investigators did not yet have full legal confirmation, but they had enough to escalate the case to a coordinated multi-state manhunt. The suspect's name, already circulating quietly within law enforcement channels, now became central to active pursuit operations. The investigation was no longer reactive. It was operational. What followed was a rapid intensification of coordination between jurisdictions. Patrol units were alerted. Highway checkpoints were adjusted. Vehicle descriptions were distributed with greater urgency. Every available resource was redirected toward locating and intercepting the individual now believed to be responsible for a series of connected crimes. It was during this period of heightened alert that a critical observation was made by a law enforcement officer on patrol. A vehicle matching the general description was spotted moving along a highway route that had previously been identified as part of the suspect's possible travel corridor. The observation alone was not enough. But it was enough to initiate a stop. What followed unfolded quickly, but not chaotically. The vehicle was approached with caution. Identification was requested. The individual inside presented himself in a manner that, at first, did not immediately confirm or deny suspicion. Calm. Composed. Cooperative. It was a familiar pattern to those who had studied previous cases. The absence of visible panic did not indicate innocence. It indicated control. When the identification was cross-checked, the situation escalated immediately. The suspect was taken into custody. At the moment of arrest, the investigative timeline, that had been fragmented for years across multiple states, began to collapse into a single, coherent structure. Cases that had once been treated as separate investigations were now being re-evaluated under a unified framework. Evidence from Florida was no longer isolated. It was part of a larger body of material being analyzed in conjunction with earlier incidents. Physical evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis all began to align in ways that strengthened the conclusion investigators had been cautiously moving toward. The suspect, identified as Ted Bundy, was now formally linked to a series of crimes spanning multiple jurisdictions. But even after arrest, the investigation did not slow. In fact, in many ways, it intensified. Because arrest was not the same as understanding. In the days following custody, investigators focused on confirming the full extent of involvement across multiple cases. Statements were taken. Evidence was re-examined. Physical comparisons were made where possible, including forensic analysis that, while limited by the technology of the time, provided additional points of correlation. One of the most significant confirmations came through behavioral consistency. The same patterns observed in Florida were reflected in earlier incidents, approach methods, environmental navigation, and interaction dynamics. These were not isolated similarities. They formed a repeatable structure. In investigative terms, repetition across independent cases is one of the strongest indicators of connection. As the case moved forward, legal proceedings began to take shape. Prosecutors prepared to present not just isolated charges, but a broader narrative of sustained criminal behavior across multiple states. Defense strategies would later attempt to fragment this narrative, but the weight of accumulated evidence made segmentation increasingly difficult to maintain. For investigators who had worked on the Florida scene, the breakthrough carried a complex emotional weight. There was relief in clarity, but also a lingering awareness that clarity did not reverse what had already occurred. It only explained it. The dormitory, once a space of confusion and fragmented discovery, now became one confirmed node in a much larger map of events. And while the identity of the perpetrator had finally been established in legal terms, the deeper questions remained. How had this pattern gone undetected for so long? How had movement across states not been interrupted earlier? How had behavioral signals that now seemed so clear once remained invisible within everyday environments? Those questions would continue far beyond the moment of arrest. Because the breakthrough did not close the case. It opened its true scale. The courtroom in Florida was not silent in the way people imagine silence. It was filled with small, restrained sounds that never quite rose into chaos, but never fully disappeared either. The shuffle of papers. The low murmur of legal teams. The faint creak of wooden benches, as people shifted under the weight of waiting. Even the air seemed different, heavier, as if it had absorbed too many days of anticipation without release. This was not just a trial about individual acts. It had become a convergence point for years of fragmented investigations, multiple jurisdictions, and dozens of interrupted lives that had finally been pulled into a single space, where they could be formally examined under the law. At the center of it all stood Ted Bundy, no longer moving through anonymous environments, or passing through spaces where he could blend into normal life. Here, he was contained by architecture, by procedure, by the rigid structure of the legal system that now defined every aspect of his presence. But what made the courtroom atmosphere so unsettling was not just his physical confinement. It was the contrast between that confinement and his behavior. Bundy did not sit in visible collapse or emotional disarray. Instead, he appeared composed, attentive, even engaged. At times he leaned forward slightly when testimony became detailed, as if studying it. At other moments, he sat back with a calm expression that seemed almost detached from the emotional weight of what was being described around him. For many observers, this disconnect was difficult to process. The courtroom was filled with families who had lived for years with absence, uncertainty, and grief that had no resolution. And yet, the person at the center of those absences appeared emotionally unshaken in a way that felt fundamentally incompatible with the content of the trial itself. The prosecution built its case not on a single event, but on accumulation. Each incident, each witness statement, each piece of forensic evidence was presented as part of a larger pattern that spanned multiple states and years. The structure of the argument was deliberate. It was designed to show not randomness, but continuity. They did not describe isolated tragedies. They described a trajectory. Witnesses were called forward one after another. Investigators, who had worked different jurisdictions, now found themselves aligned in a single courtroom narrative. Evidence collected in Florida was presented alongside material from other states, creating a layered reconstruction of movement, behavior, and opportunity. What emerged from this reconstruction was a picture of calculated mobility. The prosecution emphasized how environments that appeared safe were systematically used as points of access. Dormitories, parking areas, public spaces, all became settings where trust could be momentarily established and then exploited. The defense, however, sought to challenge this coherence. They questioned the reliability of witness memory, especially given the emotional intensity of the events. They highlighted inconsistencies in timing, variations in descriptions, and the limitations of forensic technology at the time. Their goal was not necessarily to deny all connection, but to fragment the narrative into uncertainty. In doing so, they attempted to return the case to its individual components rather than its collective pattern. But the weight of the prosecution's argument lay in repetition. Even when individual details varied, the structural similarities remained difficult to dismiss. The method of approach, the environments targeted, and the behavioral consistency across incidents created a framework that resisted simple separation. Throughout the proceedings, Bundy maintained a level of self-representation that drew significant public and legal attention. At times, he cross-examined witnesses himself. His questions were precise, often focused on small technical details in testimony. This approach created moments of tension in the courtroom, particularly when survivors or witnesses were required to revisit memories of traumatic events under direct questioning. The emotional strain of these exchanges was visible. Some witnesses paused frequently. Others struggled to maintain composure. The courtroom became not only a legal space, but also an emotional battleground where memory and interpretation collided under formal procedure. Outside the courtroom, media attention intensified. The trial was no longer just a legal proceeding, it had become a national point of focus. News coverage expanded, and public interest grew as details of the case were repeated and analyzed across different platforms. The figure of Bundy had already begun to take on a symbolic dimension beyond the immediate facts of the case, representing something broader about fear, trust, and the limits of perception. Inside the courtroom, however, symbolism had no weight. Only evidence did. Forensic specialists presented findings that, while limited by the technology of the time, provided crucial support for the prosecution's timeline. Physical evidence linked to specific locations was introduced carefully, with emphasis on chain of custody and procedural integrity. Each piece was contextualized within the broader investigative structure that had been built over years of multi-state coordination. As the trial progressed, one of the most significant challenges for the court was managing the emotional impact of testimony without allowing it to overshadow legal standards of evidence. Judges repeatedly guided proceedings back toward procedural focus, ensuring that emotion did not replace admissibility. Yet it was impossible to fully separate the two. The nature of the crimes meant that every piece of evidence carried emotional weight, and every description of events inevitably brought human suffering into the courtroom space. At one point, testimony related to the Florida dormitory incident brought the courtroom into a particularly tense silence. The reconstruction of events, as presented by investigators, emphasized the sudden disruption of normal campus life, the fragmentation of safety, and the confusion that followed discovery. Even without graphic detail, the implications were enough to shift the atmosphere noticeably. Bundy's reaction during this portion of the trial remained controlled. He did not display visible emotional response. Instead, he maintained focus on procedural aspects of the testimony, occasionally making notes or conferring briefly with his legal team. This contrast between testimony and demeanor became one of the most discussed aspects of the trial among observers. It raised questions not only about guilt, which was being addressed through evidence, but about psychological distance and perception. As closing arguments approached, both sides consolidated their positions. The prosecution emphasized pattern, consistency, and the overwhelming convergence of evidence across jurisdictions. They argued that the incidents could not reasonably be separated into unrelated events given the structural similarities and documented connections. The defense reiterated concerns about fragmentation of memory and interpretation, suggesting that the reconstruction of events risked imposing coherence where uncertainty still existed. They argued that the burden of proof required absolute certainty, not pattern-based inference. Ultimately, however, the cumulative weight of evidence presented throughout the trial proved decisive. The jury deliberated under conditions of intense public attention and legal gravity. When they returned, the verdict reflected the conclusion that had been building across weeks of testimony and years of investigation. Guilty. The courtroom did not erupt. Instead, it settled into a different kind of silence. A silence shaped not by uncertainty, but by finality. Families who had waited for years now had a formal acknowledgement of what had happened. Investigators, who had spent months reconstructing fragmented events, now saw their work translated into legal conclusion. Bundy was sentenced to death, a ruling that marked the legal endpoint of the trial phase, but not the end of public or investigative reflection. In the days that followed, the case continued to dominate national attention. Discussions expanded beyond the courtroom into broader questions about criminal behavior, systemic gaps in cross-state communication, and the psychology of deception. The trial had provided answers in legal terms, but it had also exposed deeper questions that extended beyond its scope. The figure of Bundy remained central to these discussions, not as a mystery in legal terms, but as a case study in how perception can be manipulated within ordinary environments. For those who had been directly involved in the investigation, the conclusion of the trial brought a complex mixture of resolution and reflection. The legal system had reached its judgment, but the process of understanding what had allowed such a pattern to exist in the first place continued. Because even with conviction, one question remained unresolved in a deeper sense. How many moments of normal life had been crossed before anyone realized what was happening? And how many similar blind spots might still exist, unnoticed, in places that still feel safe? After the verdict, the courtroom did not immediately return to normal life. In many ways, it never fully could. The legal conclusion had been delivered, the sentence had been issued, and the procedural weight of years of investigation had reached its formal endpoint. But emotionally, the space remained suspended, as if it had not yet caught up with what had just been decided within it. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different depending on who was experiencing it. For some, it carried relief, a sense that something long unresolved had finally been given structure and closure. For others, it carried exhaustion, as though the body itself had been holding tension for so long that release no longer felt simple or complete. Inside that divide, the case of Ted Bundy did not end so much as it transformed. It moved from active prosecution into reflection, from legal argument into historical examination, from immediate urgency into long-term consequence. But for those closest to the investigation, there was no clean separation between those stages. The aftermath was not a different chapter. It was an extension of everything that had already happened, just without the procedural structure that had previously contained it. In the weeks following sentencing, attention gradually shifted away from courtroom proceedings and toward the broader implications of the case. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began internal reviews of how earlier incidents had been handled. Files were reopened, timelines were reassessed, and communication gaps between jurisdictions were examined with renewed scrutiny. One of the most significant realizations that emerged during this period was not about the individual crimes themselves, but about the system that had allowed them to remain partially disconnected for so long. Cases that had once been treated as separate investigative challenges were now understood as pieces of a larger behavioral pattern that had not been fully visible at the time. The Florida dormitory incident, which had initially been treated as a localized emergency, was now clearly recognized as part of a broader sequence. Its significance was not only in what occurred, but in how it contributed to the eventual recognition of a multi-state trajectory. Investigators, who had worked on the case, often described a sense of retrospective clarity mixed with frustration. The patterns, once fully assembled, appeared almost obvious in structure. Yet during the actual unfolding of events, those same patterns had been fragmented across jurisdictions, delayed by communication limitations, and obscured by the assumption that each case was isolated. This tension between hindsight and real-time perception became one of the central lessons of the entire investigation. In psychological terms, the case also continued to be studied extensively. Behavioral experts examined how individuals could maintain social functionality while engaging in repeated acts of extreme violence. The contrast between external presentation and internal behavior became a focal point for academic discussion. The ability to move through public spaces without immediate detection was not understood as invisibility, but as alignment with expectation. In environments where danger is typically associated with obvious disruption, anything that does not disrupt expectation tends to be processed as safe. That cognitive tendency, repeated across different contexts, created opportunities for exploitation. This aspect of the case had implications far beyond the individual crimes. It raised questions about how trust is formed in everyday environments, how risk is perceived, and how quickly assumptions can override caution when something appears familiar. In the months and years after the trial, the name Bundy began to shift in public discourse. It was no longer just associated with a single investigation or set of crimes, but with a broader concept in criminal psychology, the idea of deception operating through normality. His case became a reference point in training, education, and research, used to illustrate how appearance and behavior can diverge significantly from intent. But within that transformation into case study and reference material, the human dimension of the events remained present. Families continued to live with absence that could not be reversed by legal outcome. Survivors and witnesses continued to process experiences that did not resolve simply because a verdict had been reached. Investigators continued to reflect on moments where earlier recognition might have altered outcomes, even if only in theory. The Florida State University dormitory itself returned eventually to normal function, but not to the same state it had occupied before the incident. Physical space can be restored, repainted, reoccupied, and reused, but memory does not follow architectural repair. For those who had been present during the investigation, certain corridors and rooms retained associations that could not be fully separated from what had occurred there. Over time, however, the immediate intensity of the case began to fade from daily public attention. New events, new investigations, and new concerns replaced it in news cycles. But the structural impact of the case did not disappear. It remained embedded in law enforcement practices, investigative training, and procedural coordination between jurisdictions. One of the most significant long-term changes influenced by the case was the increased emphasis on interagency communication. The delays and fragmentation that had characterized earlier stages of the investigation were later identified as critical weaknesses in managing multi-state criminal activity. As a result, systems were developed and refined to improve information sharing, reduce isolation between jurisdictions, and identify patterns more efficiently across geographic boundaries. In this sense, the case became not only a historical record, but a catalyst for institutional change. At a psychological level, the case also continued to shape how investigators and the public understood the concept of criminal behavior embedded within ordinary environments. The assumption that danger must present itself in clearly recognizable forms was increasingly challenged. Instead, greater attention was given to subtle behavioral indicators, inconsistencies in situational context, and the importance of cumulative rather than isolated observation. The legacy of Bundy's actions, therefore, extended beyond legal closure. It influenced how future cases were approached, how training scenarios were designed, and how awareness of behavioral patterns was integrated into investigative thinking. Yet even with these systemic and academic developments, the emotional core of the case remained unchanged. It remained anchored in the individuals whose lives were directly affected, in the moments of interruption that could not be reconstructed in full, and in the absence that continued to exist regardless of how thoroughly the events were documented. Time moved forward, as it always does, but it did not erase the structure of what had occurred. It only placed it at a greater distance, where it could be studied, analyzed, and understood with more clarity than was possible in the immediate aftermath. And still, even years later, the central tension of the case remained relevant. How something so calculated could exist within environments designed for safety. How trust could be used as access. And how normality itself could become the most effective cover for actions that fundamentally violated it. The final reflection of the case does not rest on the individual alone, but on the environments in which he operated, and the assumptions those environments relied upon. Because in the end, the most lasting impact of the story is not only what happened, but what it revealed about how easily the boundaries between safety and vulnerability can be blurred when danger does not announce itself in the way it is expected to. In the years after the trial concluded, the case of Ted Bundy continued to evolve in a way that extended far beyond its original legal boundaries. What had once been confined to courtrooms, investigative files, and crime scenes gradually transformed into something larger, more diffuse, and more deeply embedded in public consciousness. It became not only a record of criminal behavior, but also a reference point for how modern society understands manipulation, trust, and the hidden structures of violence. For investigators who had worked directly on the Florida segment of the case, the passage of time did not erase detail. Instead, it sharpened it. Memory tends to reorganize itself when distance increases, and in this case, many of those involved began to recognize patterns that had not been fully visible during the intensity of active investigation. Small decisions made under pressure, minor delays in communication, and fragmented witness coordination all took on new meaning in hindsight. The Florida State University dormitory incident, once viewed as a contained crisis within a single location, was now understood as one node in a much larger behavioral network. That realization did not change what had happened, but it changed how it was interpreted. The focus shifted from immediate resolution to structural analysis. One of the most important long-term developments in the aftermath of the case was the re-evaluation of interjurisdictional communication. At the time of the original investigations, information sharing between states was limited, often delayed, and heavily dependent on manual coordination. As a result, patterns that now appear clearly connected were not immediately recognized as such in real time. The Bundy case exposed that limitation in a way that was difficult to ignore. Separate investigative teams were working on cases that shared behavioral similarities, but because those cases were geographically dispersed, they were treated as independent events. It was only later, when evidence was consolidated, that the full scope of the pattern became visible. This realization led to gradual, but significant changes in how law enforcement agencies structured communication. Protocols were developed to ensure that behavioral indicators, not just confirmed identities, could be shared more efficiently across jurisdictions. Databases were expanded, reporting systems were standardized, and analytical frameworks were adjusted to prioritize pattern recognition across state lines. These changes were not immediate reactions, but rather incremental reforms influenced by the cumulative lessons of multiple cases, with Bundy's crimes serving as one of the most influential examples. Beyond institutional changes, the case also continued to shape psychological research. Behavioral scientists and criminologists revisited the case repeatedly, not for its procedural details alone, but for what it revealed about human perception. One of the most studied aspects was the contrast between external presentation and internal intent. Bundy's ability to navigate social environments without immediate suspicion became a focal point for understanding how trust is formed in everyday interactions. Researchers examined how certain behavioral cues, such as calm speech, appropriate appearance, and controlled demeanor, could override instinctive caution in unfamiliar situations. The conclusion was not that people are irrational, but that they are structured to prioritize social coherence over constant suspicion. This cognitive structure, while necessary for functioning in society, also creates predictable blind spots. The Bundy case became a central example used to illustrate how those blind spots can be exploited when behavioral intent does not align with social expectation. In academic discussions, the concept of psychopathic charm was further refined through analysis of cases like his. It was not defined simply as charisma, but as a strategic alignment with social norms that allows an individual to appear trustworthy without genuine emotional engagement. This distinction became important in distinguishing between surface-level social competence and deeper psychological manipulation. As research expanded, the case was incorporated into training materials for law enforcement, psychology programs, and forensic studies. It was used not only to study criminal behavior, but also to train professionals in recognizing subtle inconsistencies between context and behavior. However, even as the case became more structured in academic and institutional settings, its emotional impact remained unchanged for those directly affected. Families of victims continued to live with absence that no legal outcome could reverse. The passage of time altered the public perception of the case, but not the personal reality of loss. In many ways, the tension between public resolution and private continuation became one of the defining characteristics of the aftermath. While the legal system had reached closure, the lived experience of those involved continued without interruption. This divergence highlighted a fundamental limitation of justice systems: their inability to fully resolve emotional consequence through procedural means. For investigators, revisiting the case years later often brought a mixture of professional reflection and personal reconsideration. Some described moments during the original investigation where key information, if interpreted differently, might have altered the trajectory of earlier cases. Others emphasized that such hindsight, while intellectually valuable, could not change the structural limitations under which they had been operating at the time. What became clear over time was that the Bundy case was not simply a failure of detection, but a demonstration of how complex behavioral patterns can exist within systems not designed to recognize them in real time. The issue was not lack of effort, but lack of integrated visibility. This insight influenced future developments in criminal profiling and investigative coordination. Systems began to incorporate broader behavioral datasets, allowing for earlier identification of cross-jurisdictional similarities. Training programs emphasized the importance of looking beyond isolated incidents and considering cumulative behavioral patterns. Despite these advancements, the case continued to hold a unique position in public discourse. It was frequently referenced in discussions about safety, trust, and perception in everyday environments. The idea that danger can exist within familiar spaces without immediate recognition became a recurring theme in educational, media, and cultural analysis. Yet even as the case became widely studied, it resisted simplification. No single explanation fully captured its complexity. It existed simultaneously as a legal case, a psychological study, a procedural turning point, and a human tragedy. Over time, the name Bundy became less about the individual and more about the structure of behavior that had been analyzed through his actions. It became shorthand for a particular intersection of manipulation, mobility, and social invisibility. But behind that shorthand remained the reality of the events themselves, which could not be reduced to abstraction without losing their human dimension. The Florida dormitory incident, in particular, remained a point of reflection within investigative communities. It illustrated how ordinary environments can become sites of extraordinary disruption without immediate detection. It also demonstrated how fragmented perception during unfolding events can delay recognition of broader patterns. In that sense, the case continued to serve as both warning and lesson. It reminded investigators that safety is not only a matter of physical security, but also of perception, communication, and the ability to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information across time and space. Even decades later, the case continues to be revisited, not because its conclusions are uncertain, but because its implications remain relevant. It challenges assumptions about visibility, trust, and the boundaries between normal life and hidden threat. And perhaps most significantly, it continues to raise a question that does not belong only to the past, but to any environment shaped by human interaction. How many patterns remain unrecognized simply because they are distributed across spaces that were never designed to be viewed as a whole? That question, more than any single detail of the case, is what ensures its continued relevance in both investigative practice and public understanding. I and the final stretch of reflection on the case. After the legal system has completed its formal work and public attention has begun to drift toward newer events, what remains is not resolution in the emotional sense, but accumulation. The story of Ted Bundy does not end at the moment of conviction, or even at the moment of execution. It continues as a structure of thought that investigators, psychologists, and society at large keep returning to, not because it offers comfort, but because it exposes something fundamental about perception and vulnerability. In the years following the conclusion of the case, researchers began to separate the narrative into layers that could be studied independently. There was the behavioral layer, which examined how the offender moved through environments. There was the psychological layer, which attempted to understand the internal mechanisms that allowed sustained deception. And there was the systemic layer, which focused on how institutions responded, delayed, or failed to connect information across time and geography. Each of these layers, when examined alone, seemed manageable. But when placed together, they formed a structure that was more complex than any single discipline could fully contain. One of the most persistent questions raised in post-case analysis is how ordinary environments can function as sites of extraordinary concealment. The dormitories, parking lots, campuses, and public spaces involved in the broader investigation were not unusual locations. They were designed for routine human activity, built on assumptions of shared safety and predictable behavior. That predictability became part of the vulnerability. Investigators who revisited the case years later often emphasized that the most difficult aspect was not the lack of evidence, but the distribution of evidence across environments that were never intended to be connected. Each location, each incident, each witness account existed in isolation at first. Only later were they assembled into a continuous pattern. This fragmentation of information created a delay in recognition that proved critical. Not because individual investigators failed in their duties, but because the system itself was not yet optimized for cross-contextual analysis at the scale required. Over time, this limitation became one of the primary catalysts for reform in multi-jurisdiction communication systems. Databases were expanded to allow for behavioral pattern matching across state lines. Reporting protocols were redesigned to prioritize similarities in method and context, not just confirmed identity. Training programs began to emphasize the importance of early pattern recognition even when evidence remained incomplete. The Bundy case became a reference point in these reforms, not as an isolated anomaly, but as a demonstration of what can occur when distributed information is not synthesized in time. From a psychological perspective, the case continued to generate extensive study because it challenged simplified models of criminal behavior. One of the most important realizations was that outward normality cannot be reliably used as an indicator of internal intent. The ability to present as socially competent, articulate, and non-threatening was not incidental. It was structurally central to the effectiveness of the behavior being analyzed. This led to deeper exploration of what researchers began to describe as contextual trust exploitation. The idea that trust is not a static trait, but a situational response, activated by environmental cues, social expectations, and perceived normality. In environments where interaction with strangers is routine, the threshold for suspicion is naturally lower. That threshold becomes part of the operational space for manipulation. What made the Bundy case particularly significant in this area of study was the consistency with which this mechanism appeared across different settings. Whether in urban environments, academic campuses, or transitional public spaces, the underlying structure of approach and engagement remained remarkably stable. At the same time, researchers also examined the limitations of retrospective interpretation. One of the challenges in studying such cases is the tendency to overinterpret coherence after the fact. Once outcomes are known, patterns appear more structured than they may have been during real-time observation. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to in forensic analysis as retrospective pattern inflation, requires careful correction to avoid misleading conclusions. Despite this caution, the convergence of evidence across multiple independent investigations made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the structural similarities observed in the case. Beyond academic and institutional analysis, the cultural impact of the case also continued to evolve. Public understanding of criminal behavior shifted in subtle but important ways. There was greater awareness that danger does not always present itself through visible disruption. Instead, it can exist within the boundaries of ordinary interaction, embedded in situations that feel familiar and therefore safe. This shift in perception influenced not only law enforcement training, but also public discourse around safety, trust, and situational awareness. Educational materials began to incorporate discussions about behavioral inconsistency, emphasizing the importance of noticing not just what is present, but what feels slightly out of place within a given context. However, even as awareness increased, so too did the recognition that no system of vigilance can eliminate uncertainty entirely. Human environments are inherently complex, and the need to maintain social functioning means that constant suspicion is neither practical nor desirable. This tension between safety and openness remains unresolved. In the later stages of reflection on the Bundy case, scholars often return to the concept of invisibility through normality. Not invisibility in a literal sense, but in the cognitive sense of blending into expected patterns. When behavior aligns closely enough with environmental expectations, it becomes less likely to trigger scrutiny, even when subtle inconsistencies are present. This concept has since been applied in broader fields beyond criminology, including behavioral psychology, security studies, and even digital systems analysis. The idea that systems are most vulnerable not at their extremes, but at their points of assumed normality, has become a recurring theme in risk assessment frameworks. For those who were directly involved in the original investigations, the long-term impact of the case is often described in terms of perspective shift. Many reported that after working on such a case, their perception of everyday environments changed permanently. Not in a way that eliminated trust, but in a way that introduced an additional layer of observation beneath it. Hallways, public spaces, and social interactions were no longer perceived solely at surface level. Instead, there was an awareness of how context shapes interpretation, and how quickly assumptions can form based on limited information. Yet even with this heightened awareness, investigators consistently emphasize that the goal is not to live in constant suspicion, but to improve the quality of recognition when anomalies do occur. The final stage of the Bundy case narrative, as it exists in historical and analytical form, is therefore not closure in the emotional sense, but integration. The events are no longer viewed as isolated disruptions in time, but as part of a broader framework that informs how similar situations are understood and approached in the present. The execution of Bundy marked the end of his physical presence, but not the end of his relevance in investigative thought. His case continues to be studied, because it sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines, each of which draws different lessons from the same sequence of events. Criminal law examines it for procedural lessons. Psychology examines it for behavioral insight. Sociology examines it for structural vulnerability. Law enforcement examines it for operational improvement. And within all of these perspectives, the underlying reality remains the same. A series of environments that were assumed to be safe were used in ways that revealed gaps between perception and behavior. The final reflection that emerges from continued study is not a definitive answer, but a persistent question about the nature of recognition itself. How many signals must align before a pattern becomes visible? How many isolated moments must occur before they are understood as connected? And how many assumptions about normality must be challenged before awareness adjusts to match reality? These questions remain open not because the case is incomplete, but because the systems it revealed are still evolving. And in that ongoing evolution, the legacy of the case persists, not as a story that ends, but as a framework that continues to influence how unseen patterns are identified within the ordinary flow of life.